So we are going to spend the rest of class, the next 20 minutes or so, talking with DJ Summers, who is your TA. And he is also a grad student in magazine, newspaper, and online journalism with a sports communication emphasis. He has a bachelor's from the University of Utah in mass communication. While he was there, he was writing for the Daily Utah Chronicle, the Salt Lake City Weekly. He's also been published in the Salt Lake Tribune, the Examiner, the Guardian, and Bleacher Report. If you click on that Guardian, it'll take you to a great story about boxing and MMA in a new media environment. So, and I'll share that actively as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So he covers primarily boxing and mixed martial arts. There it is. I know the acronym. Mixed martial arts. So I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit about what you do, how you got into it, what journalism means for you, and any recommendations for the students to think about how they should be reading journalism or potential futures in the career of journalism. And then in the interest of being 1 week before our exam, I will put up all our key terms, not all, obviously the key terms that I've selected. And if you have any questions or if you want to integrate any key terms in your description, I encourage you and you are welcome to. So, what do you do?
I write stories for public consumption about things that go on and try to contextualize them.
Okay.
What
does that mean?
That means I have to take something that happened and then write about it in a way that people can consume it so that they know what's going on. Not just what happened there, but what it means in a more broad sense for the environment around it. So you can't take one isolated incident about, I think we were talking the other day about like the Boston bombing or something like that. This is where we get into the lines between like what reporting is and what journalism is. Like anyone can report something. Somebody was at the Boston bombing or something like that, the Boston Marathon bombing, and then report and say, holy shit, a bomb just went off. Like, does that necessarily make them a journalist, though? The journalist's job is to take that fact and put it into context. It happened here, it happened because of this is what's happening because of it. So that's what you have to do as a journalist, and that's what I try to do with my work from day to day, is take something that happened and say, what does this mean?
So how did you get into journalism?
I actually wanted to be a fiction writer before I ever wanted to do anything with journalism. I wanted to write fiction, but that's not the kind of thing that you just hand in an application for and hey, I'd like to be the next award-winning novelist, please. I'll take that job whenever it comes up. So I said maybe I'll try to do something a little bit more practical with my time, something that might actually earn me a living wage. I'm not into the whole bohemian drinking coffee and smoking Luckies in the coffee shop scene.
With no health insurance.
With no health insurance and a big beard and corduroy jacket and that kind of thing. So I said, well, what's close? Journalism is close. Journalism is a way that you can actually hone your writing skills and develop your craft. Hemingway was a journalist. I actually really a big fan of Hemingway, and so I said, well, maybe I could give journalism a try. And so I applied to write at my student paper at the University of Utah and got my assignments and started doing it. And as I started doing it more and more, I was like, I actually like doing this. I actually like doing this more than I like writing fiction to begin with. Writing fiction is hard, and I still enjoy writing fiction, but I really like the exposure and the truth-telling aspect to it. So as I got more and more immersed into journalism, the more and more I liked it, and the more I considered it a viable career option. And now all of a sudden it's a viable career option.
Can you think about the first story you enjoyed writing? I probably should have given you that one as a lead. It just came to me.
The first story I enjoyed
writing? Or
writing?
one of the early ones that you were like, this is a story I'm glad that I wrote. I learned something about myself. I learned something about my craft. I might actually be able to pursue this.
That's an interesting story. I remember I was doing boxing commentary for Examiner.com, which is, like the epitome of of consumer content production. It has no credibility, no legitimacy whatsoever. You just sign up so that it can, your mom and your friends can read your articles about whatever the hell you're writing about. So I signed up to do that because I had no byline anywhere else, and that's what you do when you're 20 years old and whatever. Have no byline, nowhere else to do it. And I started writing about boxing. I remember the U.S. Medical Association came out with an article that said boxing is bad for children, amateur boxing is bad for children, and so I went down a statistical analysis of the level of injuries and the level of concussions in every sport reported in that year. And boxing was on the low end of the list, actually. There are fewer boxing injuries associated with amateur boxing than there are jumping on like a trampoline. And so I remember writing a story about that and thinking, that felt good. I actually feel like I got to, report something. Something that might have been helpful to someone at some point, maybe.
What else do you think makes you a journalist? What makes you a journalist and not just reporting the news? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Like I said before, a journalist will contextualize what's going on where a citizen reporter cannot. A journalist has contacts. They have the skills to be able to tell the story cleanly and concisely, incorporating all of the facts, incorporating all of the possible facts, all of the questions, and from an access point, they can do a lot more than someone who's just reporting can do. Someone might be able to say, yes, I saw the Boston bombing, I saw that this many people were injured, I saw the cops, but they might not have the network of affiliations and the network of contacts to go in the police department and into hospitals and say, this is their condition, this is what we're doing about it, it'll take this long, and we have these suspects under consideration right now. So the difference between someone who just reports the news at a citizen level and a professional journalist is kind of hazy, but it gets more concrete the more professional additions you have, like a contact base and sources and stuff like that.
So when you were working at the Salt Lake Tribune, what was your beat? What is a beat, first of all? What is a beat? And then what was your beat at the Salt Lake Tribune?
There are two people who function on beats, cops and journalists. Cops have a beat like a neighborhood beat, and it's very, very similar with journalism if you're working at like a paper, or even if you're just working at a purely online media outlet, then everybody has a beat. That's that one section of society that you look out for. Someone will be on like the cops beat. All they do is talk to cops. Someone will be on the politics beat. All they do is spend all day, every single day at the legislative office. I was on the communities desk, and so I did stuff that wasn't covered by all of the other stuff. It was kind of a catch-all for all the stuff that didn't get caught and didn't really fit into some of the other desks, like justice or civic or anything like that. So say there's a veterinarian who killed one too many pets in their life, and so they have a bunch of complaints. That was the kind of stuff that I took a look at. Or if something small came up, somebody won a special award in a town, a civic medal or something like that, that's also the kind of stuff that I would cover.
So as an experienced journalist and someone who has worked in the industry, what recommendations would you give to media consumers? What have you noticed in reading journalism that you feel you have a unique eye for from being on the other side of the actual physical press?
To consume news, you have to consume it from several different sources to actually get a good latch on what's happening. We talk a lot, in the SPJ ethics code and everything, it always talks about reporting fairly and reporting honestly, and you hear all these things about journalistic objectivity and everything like that, and that's an excellent standard to strive for. So is running a marathon. Those are completely unattainable goals, not because they're ignoble goals, but because they're we're not angels. So when you're consuming media, you have to recognize that despite all of the high values of journalistic objectivity, everyone who's written that piece has a bias, and they may be actively trying to avoid putting their bias into their work, but just merely the fact that they have a bias it'll creep in somehow, just in the kinds of facts that they choose to think are relevant, something like that, you know? Like, I can tell you that at the Salt Lake Tribune, you know, everyone had a predominant way of looking at the world, and they talked to each other around the water cooler, and they drank coffee together and everything like that, you know, and it's like that in most news organizations. So as you consume news, you have to remember, no matter what kind of journalistic objectivity they're touting, everybody's got a bias, and it creeps in very unexpected levels. So in order to vet that, you kind of have to jump around to different media sources, see who's leaving out what little bits, and that's the best way to critically consume the news, is to critically consume from several different sources so that you don't miss anything. Because if it's a journalist's job to contextualize and someone is leaving out a piece of that context, then that piece of news might as well be useless for you.
Is there a difference between a culture within a newsroom and a bias within a newsroom?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
There is a difference between culture within a newsroom and an outright bias, I think. There's, you know, journalists, some journalists anyway, newspaper journalists from the bigger legacy media have a reputation for being like really disheveled and grizzled and hard drinking and old school 1950s labor union Democrat. And so there's a difference between like the culture, just the water cooler culture, and a larger outright bias that comes in usually from the editorial side if they have direct command to just basically follow a certain line of editorial standards that have little biases put in them. For example, a lot of newspapers refuse to use the term, I think it's actually AP style, like they do not use the term pro-life or pro-choice. Those are loaded terms. They say pro-abortion or anti-abortion. Anything else could be, you know, misconstrued as an internal bias, because you don't want to see people saying pro-life because it has, you know, this connotation, or pro-choice because it has a different connotation. So you have to use terms like that in order to combat just internal editorial bias, because they know it exists, they know it's there, and so they have to do everything just to check it within themselves. That didn't effectively answer your question.
That's okay.
But we'll move on.
We'll move on. What was my question?
Your question was...
I'm not a very good journalist.
Your question was, what's the difference between like a company culture and a company bias?
Right.
A company, a company culture doesn't seep into the work. A company bias seeps into the work. So you can have a company culture and take very careful strides to lock it as only a culture. And then if it comes anywhere past that, if you let it go into your work, then it becomes a company-wide bias.
Okay. So the extent to which it affects
The extent
the
to which
actual
it affects
stories.
your reportage is how it goes.
So then I'll ask you one more question before we open it up to anybody else who would like to ask any questions about journalism, any questions about our key terms. We'll talk a little bit about cultural values of journalism as well. What recommendations would you have? Has anybody written for online content? Said the Examiner was consumer-based. Has anybody written content that got posted online that got read by people you don't know? A few of you, okay. And have any of you ever thought about actually pursuing a career in journalism? Especially, a lot of you are coming out of other majors as well. All right, so what would you recommend to people, to students who are considering a career in journalism?
Have an expertise and be able to quickly and effectively get a survey of any situation and then chop it down and boil it down to its essentials. What we're seeing now in journalism is that the general news audience is kind of declining because everybody has access to their own little hobbit holes of information. Everybody has access to their own, chat rooms and their own websites that cater only to their 100% specific interests and needs. You know, I don't have to sift through a paper that's reporting on general terms to find something that might appeal to me. I can go directly online and look up the most esoteric pinhole of information, and there will be an entire forum dedicated only to discussing that. So the general news journalist is kind of not a dying breed, because there's still outlets for it, but where the money is someone who is an expert at something who can then spit that back out in digestible terms to an audience that needs that information. So if you're considering journalism, then my best advice to you is to have an expertise of some kind. Be a business-minded person and go into journalism for the business community. You know, write for Forbes, write for Fortune, write for Business Insider. Or be an expert on, you know, mechanics, be an expert on technology, something like that. Because if you are an expert in something, then you can learn how to cut it down for the consumption of people who need that information. And those are the people who are willing to pay for it now, and that's how you can make a living in today's journalistic world, which is not particularly easy to make a living in.
So I have a couple other questions, but I'll open it up to the floor. Does anybody have any questions for DJ on his experience as a journalist? Thoughts that you might have about his deeming something newsworthy? Anybody? Erica.
What are your future goals for journalism? Where do you see yourself?
I wanted to write, initially, I really wanted to do business news. I wanted to write for like Forbes, something like that. But since coming here, the program has gotten me to think about some things differently, and I've actually gotten a columnist position now at Bleacher Report, and so it's looking more and more like I'm probably going to go back to out west. I'm going to end up probably in Las Vegas or Los Angeles and look for a columnist position there, either stay with Bleacher Report or probably get on like the Las Vegas Sun, Los Angeles Times, and then from there probably go into magazine. Magazine editing is actually one of the only print operations that are doing well. Like, newspapers aren't dying exactly. That's a misnomer. If you ever hear that, it's an oversimplification. But magazines have been doing extraordinarily well. They're still profitable. And I prefer to write for a magazine. It's just an easier, it's an easier routine, an easier schedule. So that's where I'm probably trying to head, and then probably try to write books. Every journalist wants to write a book. They all started out wanting to be novelists and then gave up, like me. So.
Excellent. Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
You can do it.
I can do it. I can do it.
Real simple.
I had it like 2 weeks ago. Tell me.
Mike.
Mike! Mike!
That is simple. What's up, Mike?
Going back to we were talking about biases and cultures in the newsroom. Have you ever witnessed or ever experienced it yourself where the higher up people who are in charge will tell someone who's writing a story, make it sound like this, spin it in this direction?
No, you won't hear him say spin it like this.
Right.
That would be, that's a little too much. I mean, it happens on more insidious kind of terms than that. It'll be somebody tweaking the language to make it sound cleaner,
Right.
when in reality they're making the language sound more to their liking.
Okay.
But it'll never be, or it'll rarely be anyway, at that level where they're like, make it sound like this, we're promoting such and such agenda, and that's how it's going to be. That doesn't happen. It'll be subtle. It'll be language changes to make things in style more, or something like that.
It's also worthwhile to talk about censorship versus self-censorship.
Right.
If you know a story isn't going to pass your editor, you might voluntarily change your own or spin it yourself so that you can excel further, right? We all have very personal interests. So there's also making it to the editor for him or her to slash, and slashing it internally so that ideally it will make it further.
Okay.
So it's just another way of thinking about a similar question. Shelby.
When you say that you're making sure that you're more concise, like, what do you mean exactly? Like,
clean writing means active voice, few syllables, newspaper style. Journalists write that way because newsprint is a valuable commodity and it costs a lot to print a newspaper. And so newspaper writing style developed entirely around that, and a couple other things, like in the Civil War, because their copy would be, killed, and the telegraph wires might be cut by your enemy lines, and they said, we need to get everything out as quickly as possible, so if you're sending us a wire, then you can get us all the necessary information before they cut the telegraph line on you. So that's how they gave us newspaper style now, where it's who, what, where, when, why, all in the first paragraph. They call it, the lead paragraph. And that's newspaper style. So when I say like cleaning things up, I take a 10-word sentence and cut it down to like 5 or 6 words. Everything is measured in inches in column space in a newspaper, an actual print newspaper. It'll all be measured in inches. And so you'll hand somebody like a 20-inch story and say, cut it down 10 inches. We don't need 10 inches of that. And so you have to play with language and make sure that you're using strong, clean verbs and simple language to get that across. Like when you read Hemingway or something, that's what you're seeing, is you're seeing the newspaper influence. Everything he says is, the guy played the piano. Then that guy got shot. Then, I killed myself or whatever. Like, that's what you mean by clean language. Very simple and straightforward. Tells the story, not ornamental at all.
So we're running out of time. I would actually love for you to answer one question real briefly before we start packing up. And that is, what are you an expert in? And how is journalism integral into developing that expertise?
I'm not really an expert in anything, I think. I'm conversant with boxing, with mixed martial arts, with a couple other things, some business things about economics, first and foremost, and maybe some literature. But I'm an expert in taking what experts say and making it digestible for a citizen who can't understand what the experts say.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that.